Hello everyone, and welcome to Pyanodons Mods. This is Otaku Showboat, and today we are going to be talking about optical fiber in detail. If you've been enjoying the tutorial series thus far, please be sure to do all the social and engagement stuff below the video. You can, of course, follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/otakushowboat. You can support me at patreon.com/otakushowboat, and you can support Pyanodon's mods development at patreon.com/pyanodon. I have a dolly fighting over her toy. Dolly has brought me her toy, her baby, and she's going to watch as her baby goes flying. And then she runs after it, and then we'll bring it back to me. Because these kittens play fetch. Obviously, kittens play fetch. Alright, optical fiber. Optical fiber is necessary to get into two very important things during green science as you work your way towards the blue science, chemical science, as well as pi science. So, at the point in the game where you are planning on making these things, you absolutely need to have green science by now. You have green science, and you are thinking about going into neuroprocessors most likely as your first order of business. And then you'll think a bit about circuit 2s. You'll very much want to do pi science first. Why? Because it's easier than going into chemical science. Plus, chemical science also has vat brain biocomputing available to it that you can actually do even before you do this. So you're not as pushed into doing chemical science, but you absolutely need to do pi science to continue your progression and to get access to some beautiful recipes, as well as some creature stuff from pi alien life. So this optical fiber will be necessary for that, because it's needed. You need it for the neuroprocessors. Anyway, enough about that. Optical fiber is a pretty linear processing chain, but in order to get into it, you will need a few things. In particular, you need molybdenum to go into this process because you need aramid fiber. Molybdenum, aramid fiber. I'm realizing I have not set that yet in this list. So, from the top, optical fiber requires plastic and iron niobium coating. The plastic I have down here, just an example of how to get plastic. You likely already have a solution for plastic by the point in the game that you need to start making optical fiber. Of course, this video is from the perspective of you are making this for the first time and you are not upgrading it later. There are many options, of course, in the Pi suite to upgrade processes in the future, such as there is an alternative recipe to make aramid fiber much later on in the game. I'm not presenting that to you now because this is from the perspective of someone just getting into it for the first time, and of course you're not going to be using an upgraded recipe to get into the aramid for the first time. Alright, from here, with the iron niobium coating, note the ratios here. We've got 1 to 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 3 to 1 to 1 to 1, etc. We are looking at the total output here from one factory. 100% output from one factory at 1.5 optical fiber per second is what we're looking at here, just as an example. Okay, and just note it's actually genuinely 1 to 1 to 1, not quite 1, not even remotely close to 1, not 1, not 1, not 1, not 1, not 3, technically, not 1, not 1, we're at 0.4. On the tooltip here, it's telling you what the true quantity is, 0.53, etc., etc. You will need to make the iron niobium coating, you need iron niobium alloy. At this phase of the game, you have access to the molten casting, most likely, more likely than not. Yeah, you'll likely have this. If you don't have it, then there's the standard plate casting. Just know it's generally speaking better to do the hot air casting on molten because you get an extra 25% bonus on top of the normal increase, and it's rounded to the next highest whole number there on that 25% boost. So from here, in order to make Kevlar coating, we of course will need Kevlar as well as copper coating. Kevlar, two options to make Kevlar. One is objectively worse than the other. I would always do the nylon method. Uh, it is PPD plus nylon plus terephthalonyl chloride, TCl, which recipe code is TPA for some reason. And then organic solvent. I'll leave it up to you as to how you want to get your organic solvent. I always use syngas acetone for my organic solvent. Just note, though, this TCl also appears up here for your aramid fiber. What is the terephthalol? Hello, Dolly. You've brought your baby. So note that this terephthalonyl chloride is going to be a consumer of nichrome, an actual consumer, dedicated consumer of nichrome, and it needs liquid nitrogen, which of course is also going to need gasoline. If you don't have liquid nitrogen set up yet, she is now playing on the desk next to me. Oh boy, yep. And you need a solution for aromatics, and I need to sneeze. Excuse me for that. Anyway, she's like being very naughty right now. Dolly. Dolly's being naughty. Hey, I've got I've got your toy. Hey, Dolly. Dolly, there's your toy. You're going to run after your toy now. As I have yet another video that is full of the kittens making a mockery of my points that I'm trying to make. Alright. TCl is going to consume nichrome. You need to have a solution for aromatics. Depending on how you play, it's either going to be creosote from tar or some other way, I guess. I mean, most of the time it's probably going to be that creosote from tar. The other methods aren't that particularly great. But because you need benzene in this process, like, well, need benzene. If you're doing plastic on site out of benzene ethylene, and if you're using benzene as a fuel for glassworks buildings, you'll end up with extra 1-to-1 benzene aromatics, so you'll end up with enough aromatics-ish that, yeah, to make the amount of terephthalonyl chloride that you need, but yeah, you might not be doing all of that on site. Just know that you will have aromatics if you are doing benzene out of coal water slurry fuel, which is tailings, which is one of the easiest possible things that you can make in the pie suite, just on demand. One of few things that is pretty simple on demand type of a substance. All right, from here, that's what I had to say about the TCl. I haven't actually broken the PPD down. PPD is going to need ammonia and nitrobenzene, which again, benzene plus sulfuric acid plus ammonia, and chlorine. I'll leave it to you as to how you want to get the ammonia and the chlorine. I always do vat-brain biocomputing to unlock the recipe for ammonia that is the nitrogen, hydrogen, chromium recipe, but that is not going to be available to you if you have not done vat-brain biocomputing. So instead, your only option is to really just burn urea or overproduce on the organic solvent recipe acetone syngas to get enough ammonia for your needs. That's a little bit beyond the pale, though. It's a little bit too big of a build to do that, to try and prioritize the ammonia out of this. It's not as convenient as the organic solvent is, and you'll want the organic solvent, I'd say, a bit more than you want the ammonia out of this. You would be vastly overproducing on your organic solvent to get the amount of ammonia that you need for this process. So from the Kevlar, that also needs nylon. So we've talked about PPD, we've talked about the terephthyl chloride. The kitty has returned with her toy. Yes, here's your toy. You're following your toy. Go get it. There you go. She is off again, chasing after her toy. We also need nylon. Nylon is going to have two options. You can either throw nichrome at the problem with benzene, ammonia, and chlorine. Benzene, ammonia, and chlorine. Benzene, ammonia, and chlorine. Three of the things you're already using in this process. There's a reason this nylon recipe exists, is because you use benzene, ammonia, and chlorine to get into optical fiber already. This just uses a lot of stuff though, and it consumes nichrome. I don't like things that are optional that consume nichrome. And of course, Dolly has returned with her toy. She has brought it back. So I do the regular chromium plus phenol plus blood meal. Hello, my Dolly. You are. I have to like throw this towel off. She's just. Hello. Here. Follow. 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 Chase. Off she goes. Again. So I do the other recipe, the one that uses the blood meal. Unfortunately, blood meal is a problem in and of itself because it's going to consume fiberboard. You will have access to the sodium sulfate fiberboard at this point, so that's a bit easier to deal with. It is going to consume a bit of sulfuric acid, though. Yeah, I need to add the water above. Thank you. Yeah, just Helmod being Helmod. You'll need a little bit of the sulfuric, but you need sulfuric acid anyway in this whole process, so you'll have to have that set up too. Your choice of how you want to get into sulfuric. I prefer vanilla sulfuric, to be completely honest, these days. This is technically one of the best. Dolly. Yes, I hear you. Yes, I hear you. Dolly. Dolly, you're active today. You're very active right now in my video. In my video about optical fiber, here's the toy again. It has returned. Whee! You'll get it. She's literally playing fetch. This is now a cat fetch video. This is now a video about the kittens playing fetch with Dolly playing fetch. She is 6 months old, but 1 day from being 6 months old. By the time you watch this, she'll be 6 months old. Anyway, fiberboard. Yeah, you can make the sodium sulfate to do that particular fiberboard recipe by now, and use that for the blood meal. You'll still need blood for blood meal. I mean, obvious. You'll need blood for blood meal, of which your blood of choice is likely going to be kitten, toy. Go get it. Of which you're likely going to choose AUG-based blood at this phase of the game. Most likely, AUGs are going to be the one that you have by now. It all will come down to whether or not you have set up artificial blood yet, whether or not you've done your rare earth processing to get into cobalt extract and so on, to get into artificial blood so that you can actually make your first Muckmo. Muckmo are objectively better at giving you blood than the Augs. They give you a few more blood, 30 more blood per Muckmo, although the buildings are bigger, they take a bunch of stuff to make them, etc., etc. They're best at manure, not necessarily getting slaughtered for blood. They also give you a bunch of guts. Just gonna throw that out there too. They also, Mukmo are pretty good for guts as well. They eat Relesia, if you care about that, plus Phalagi. Basically everything here stems from water. It's fine. The food's a little bit more difficult to make. So it's ultimately your choice, depending on what you have access to. Oggs versus Mukmo on blood to do the blood meal for the nylon. It also needs phenol, but of course, you do have cumene-based phenol or filtration media coal. I try to avoid anything that uses my zinc, so filtration media uses zinc chloride in the form of the activated carbon. It's zinc into zinc chloride into activated carbon into filtration media. I try to avoid filtration media usage wherever possible. This also uses a bunch of coal. It gives you a bunch of coke that you have to deal with, which is a solid fuel, which is always painful to have to deal with a solid fuel byproduct, especially in this case when it's a whole bunch of coke to have to deal with. Cumene phenol is going to be the option of choice, but again, vat brain biocomputing. If you have done your chemical science vat brain biocomputing, the most important recipe to unlock is the distillate based cumene recipe. Otherwise, you have to spend phosphoric acid to get into cumene, and that's just not a thing that you want to have to deal with. Because then you also have to do the entirety of phosphate processing before you can even think about doing this entire setup. So, yeah, it's like you either get this, which is ceramic, more benzene, propene, and phosphoric, or you can vat brain biocompute some chemical science to get into the stripped distillates cumene recipe, which I'm going to say is always going to be better than this. Always going to be better than this, and avoiding the entire phosphoric acid chain going into this. Not like you need much anyway at this scale of the phenol. Okay, that's Kevlar discussed. What's from there? There's actually not too much left. That's like the majority of the complexity comes from the Kevlar and the aramid. But yeah, big discussion there. Just all on the Kevlar. The copper coating is copper plus cladded cores plus organic solvent, which of course, as I've mentioned, organic solvent, syngas acetone. Syngas acetone. Makes it pretty decent to do the vat brain biocomputing at that point to get your source of the organic solvent by the acetone and a whole bunch of byproduct phenol you can use for other things, huh? So yeah, then the cladded cores need cladding. The cladded cores need cladding, which yep, more nitrobenzene plus niobium complex, which is the molten niobium. It's a couple of steps removed from the casting of niobium plates, this niobium complex. So you will have to bring this in wherever you're doing the cladding for these cladded cores. Just note that you also need the iron niobium alloy, which would also be niobium complex with molten iron. So you can end up with two things there, needing niobium complex for this chain, just as a point of significant note in regards to the cladding. You also need aramid fiber in this, and aramid fiber is molybdenum. So I have an entire video about the molybdenum processing chain that you can go watch with to get molybdenum in the first place. You also need aluminium plate. Oh joy, oh bliss! Aluminium plate plus titanium plate plus sodium hydroxide, which you're also going to need if you're doing the nylon out of blood meal. Just another point of note. You need more terephthalochloride, which we've discussed now at this point. Best to probably do both Kevlar and aramid together because of that. And a bit of sulfuric acid again. Just your choice, sulfuric acid. I tend to prefer vanilla recipe these days, but the petroleum gas one is technically the best of all of the various ways of getting into sulfuric acid. The reason, I didn't state the reason yet in this particular video, why this particular sulfuric acid is the best option, quote unquote, the best option, is because the aromatics, there is a recipe that converts aromatics and hydrogen into petroleum gas, and this recipe gives you enough aromatics back to produce the petroleum gas to keep this cycle moving. So all you really spend is hydrogen and the tin chromium alloy to do that recipe. So you're still spending tin chromium alloy and chromium to do this, to make this sulfuric acid, but the acid gas is pretty easy-ish to obtain, depending on how you're getting your acid gas. Just up to you whether or not you want it to be out of cadaveric aurum or some other process. Tailings dust from tailings gives acid gas. So yeah, that's a really good ratio, acid gas into sulfuric. It's just at the cost of a couple, well, an alloy, a metal, chromium, and power for hydrogen plus water, which makes steam that you could cycle back to water. I don't. But yeah, this is technically one of the best, if it is the best sulfuric acid from acid gas at the very least, and I would say the best sulfuric acid if you want to avoid sulfur iron cost on the vanilla. I'm okay with it these days. I just stick with vanilla recipe for that. Speaking of which, you do need silver anyway, because our next thing is to make the glass cores. The glass cores are going to be cast out of molten glass in a glassworks building with whatever fluid fuel of choice. I, of course, these days do prefer benzene because of coal water slurry fuel. I prefer it because of coal water slurry fuel coming directly from tailings. It's basically a way to spend tailings on power. Way to use tailings to make to power and fuel my glassworks. A little bit of hot air, because hot air casting gives you 25% more free, which in this case means like an extra +1. We go from 1 to 2. So yes, an extra 25% by going to hot air, but rounding means you get an extra 100% output by just throwing a bit of hot air at the problem. And yeah, and it uses silver, so you have to make sure you have silver for this as well. And that pretty much will cover, quite scattershot, cover the entirety of the optical fiber. I said it was a bit linear, but with the caveat of aramid is not quite linear, because you need all the moly stuff after that, though moly itself is pretty linear. And you need the Kevlar, which will depend on how you make your nylon. Note that if you are in the midst of also preparing for Circuit 2s, you are going to need nylon anyway. If you are going into PCB 2s for your neuroprocessors and for your Circuit 2s, of which this first initial thing is probably you're making the optical fiber for neuroprocessors. Going into PCB2s, you're going to need nylon anyway for nylon parts, so make sure you overproduce these wherever you're producing the wherever you're producing the nylon. You'll need even more to go into PCB2s, just as a side note. as we go forward. I might have a separate video just about PCB2s because they are used in multiple things, uh, but maybe not. Maybe I'll just talk about it twice in the, or just each time it comes up, uh, neuroprocessors and circuit 2s. But anyway, with that, folks, Dolly has finally left me. I would like to thank you all for watching. This has been Otaku Showboat. If you have, for some reason, enjoyed today's video talking about optical fiber, please be sure to do all of the social and engagement stuff below the video. You can, of course, follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/otakushowboat. You can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/otakushowboat if you are willing and able. And you can, of course, also support Pyanodon's Monster Development at patreon.com/Pyanodon. I will see you all on the next one.